lion stands alone in the dry grass of the African savanna. His mane, once dark and full, now hangs heavy and matted. Blood drips from a wound across his chest. His left eye is swollen shut. He's breathing hard, each breath a struggle, each exhale carrying pain that makes him grunt. This is Rampage. For 7 years he was the undisputed king of the Kalahari Reserve. 260 kilos of pure muscle and dominance. Lions that heard his roar miles away would turn and run. Prides would scatter when his shadow appeared on the horizon. He had fathered more cubs than any other male in the reserve's history. He had held territory bigger than most small countries. He was unstoppable, invincible, immortal. But that was before the attack. That was before he learned that even kings can fall. 3 weeks ago, Rampage was patrolling the northern border of his territory when he found them, 2 nomadic males trying to sneak through the bush at night. They were young, maybe 6 years old, hungry-looking, desperate, the kind of males that die alone in the wilderness within months. Rampage had seen hundreds like them. They never made it. They always died. So he didn't see them as a real threat. He was already heading back toward the Pride when he heard the roar. Not from those 2, from somewhere deeper in the bush. Then another roar answered. Then another. And another. 5 males. Not 2. 5. And they were coordinated. That's when Rampage understood. The 2 young nomads weren't trying to take his territory. They were bait. The real threat was already inside his borders, moving through the darkness like shadows, like ghosts. Rampage turned around immediately. His body knew what his mind was refusing to accept. This wasn't just another territorial dispute. This was something organized, something planned. He roared. One massive ground-shaking roar that echoed across the entire reserve. The sound said everything. This is my land. Get out or die. But the 5 males didn't scatter. They didn't run. Instead, they moved toward the sound. They were coming for him. And they were coming with a purpose that went beyond simple dominance. They wanted something specific. They wanted to break him. When they finally emerged from the bush, Rampage saw them clearly for the first time. 4 dark males and 1 scarred male with a limp. The scarred male was missing part of his right ear, torn away in some previous battle. These weren't young lions. These weren't inexperienced fighters. These were veterans, surviving males who had won their share of battles. They looked at Rampage the way a pack of wolves looks at a solitary deer. They looked hungry. They looked coordinated. They looked like they had already decided how this was going to end. Rampage didn't hesitate. He never did. Hesitation was something he left behind when he was 2 years old. He charged directly at the scarred male, the one he perceived as the weakest link. But that was his mistake. The scarred male wasn't running away. He was holding his ground, and when Rampage got within striking distance, the other 4 males attacked from different angles simultaneously. One came from the left, one from the right, one from behind, and one went low at his legs. It was the same tactic the Majingulan had used against the Mapogo, the same strategy that had killed dozens of males across the reserve. Divide and conquer. Create multiple threats simultaneously so the target can't focus his defense in one direction. Rampage was strong enough to handle 2. He was powerful enough to fight 3. But 4 coordinated attackers hitting him from every direction at once was something different. It was something that even a king couldn't overcome. The first male locked his jaws around Rampage's throat. The second drove his teeth into the king's shoulder, trying to dislocate the joint. The third attacked the hindquarters, targeting the rear legs. The fourth, the scarred one, went for the spine. Rampage fought back with everything he had. He was stronger than any of them individually. He had more muscle, more weight, more experience. But they had numbers. They had coordination. They had a plan. And he was the target of that plan. For almost 5 minutes, the fight was a storm of dust and roars and clashing teeth. Rampage managed to break free from the first male's grip on his throat. He twisted hard enough to wound the second attacker across the face. He kicked backward hard enough to make the third male yelp and momentarily release his grip. For just a second, he had separation. For just a second, he could have run. But running was not in Rampage's nature. He had never run from anything in his entire life. He had always stood and fought. So he turned back toward the attackers instead of running toward safety. That decision cost him everything. The 4 males regrouped faster than he expected. They hit him again, this time with even more aggression. They had tasted tasted his blood. They knew he could bleed. They knew he could be hurt. And that knowledge changed something in them. The scarred male, the one with the missing ear, drove his teeth straight into Rampage's left eye socket. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. It was the kind of pain that breaks an animal's will. It's the kind of pain that makes survival instinct override dominance. But even with his vision suddenly gone on that side, even with blood pouring down his face, Rampage kept fighting. He broke free one more time. This time he ran. Not because he was afraid, not because he had accepted defeat, but because something inside him understood that staying meant dying. And a dead king couldn't protect his pride. A dead king couldn't defend his females. A dead king couldn't pass his genes to the next generation. So for the first time anyone could remember, Rampage turned his back on a fight and ran into the darkness. The 5 males chased him for almost a kilometer before giving up. They couldn't match his speed, not even with him being injured. He was still over 200 kilos of muscle, and raw speed was one thing they couldn't take from him. But they didn't need to kill him. They had accomplished something almost more important. They had shown the entire reserve that the king could bleed. They had shown that the king could run. They had broken the myth of invincibility that had protected Rampage for 7 years. By the next morning, every lion in the reserve knew what had happened. The news traveled the way news always travels in the bush, through roars, through scent markings, through the behavior of lions who suddenly moved with less caution in places where they would have moved with maximum caution before. The 5 males didn't even need to take the territory. Just by wounding the king, they had already claimed most of the power structure. Rampage's pride saw the injuries. They saw the swollen eye. They saw the missing fur and the deep bite marks, and the way their protector moved now, with something that looked like pain, and something shifted in them. This is where the real story begins. Not with the fight itself, but with what happened after. With the silence, with the way a wounded king's voice changes everything for everyone who hears it. Rampage spent 2 weeks recovering in the western sector of his territory. His favorite spot was a small river with clear water and thick acacia trees on both banks. The water helped wash away the infection that was trying to set into his eye wound. The shade kept him cool during the hottest parts of the day. But mostly, he was alone. He couldn't hunt. The pain in his shoulder made every movement agony. The swelling around his left eye wouldn't go down. His body was telling him to rest, to heal, to stay still. His pride was telling him something different. They were leaving, not all at once, not dramatically, but one by one. The younger lionesses began moving to the edges of his territory. The cubs he had fathered started following their mothers away from the pride center. The older females, the ones who had been with him for years, stopped approaching him during feeding. When he tried to roar at night, his voice came out damaged. The scarred male had done something when his teeth locked around Rampage's throat that had affected the king's vocal cords. Now when Rampage tried to produce his famous ground-shaking roar, the sound came out as something broken, something wrong, something that didn't sound like a king anymore. The first night he roared and heard his own damaged voice echo back at him. Rampage understood what was happening. A lion's roar is everything. It's his authority. It's his communication system. It's the voice that tells every other animal for miles around exactly where he is and exactly how powerful he is. When a king loses his roar, he loses something more important than strength. He loses presence. He loses the ability to command respect without fighting. And in the lion world, that loss of presence is often the beginning of the end. The 5 males who had attacked him were still out there. Rangers had tracked their movements, and they were staying on the border of Rampage's territory. They were waiting, not for Rampage to get strong again. They were waiting for him to get weak enough that the pride would abandon him. They understood something about lion society that most animals never figure out. The strongest male doesn't always win. The male that his own pride still believes in wins. And they were betting that Rampage's pride would stop believing in him long before his body stopped healing. Within 3 weeks, the 5 males made their first formal challenge. They roared from the eastern boundary, calling out Rampage's name through the darkness. The challenge was unmistakable. Come fight us again. Defend your territory, or admit that you're finished. Rampage
fight us
heard the
again.
roars from
Defend
where
your
he was
territory,
resting near the
or admit
river.
that you're
He
finished.
heard the challenge in every
Rampage
note,
heard the
and he
roars
tried
from
to
where he
answer.
was resting near
He
the
lifted
river.
his head and
He heard
opened
the
his
challenge in
jaws and
every
tried
note,
to produce
and
that
he tried to answer.
ground-shaking roar that had
He
been
lifted
his
his head
signature
and
for
opened his
7
jaws
years.
and tried
What
to
came
produce
out was
that
a sound that
ground-shaking
made the
roar
whole
that had been
pride
his
flinch.
signature
It
for
wasn't a
7 years.
roar. It was
What came
more like a
out
wounded
was a sound
animal's
that made the
cry.
whole pride
It was
flinch.
desperate and broken,
It wasn't a roar.
and nothing like the
It was
sound
more
of
like
a
a
king.
wounded
And
animal's
in that
cry.
moment,
It was
everyone
desperate and
understood.
broken,
The
and
invaders
nothing like the
understood.
sound of a king.
The pride
And in that
understood.
moment,
Even
everyone
Rampage
understood.
himself
The invaders understood.
The king
the
had
pride
changed,
understood.
not
Even
because he was
Rampage
weak.
himself
His
understood.
muscles were
The
still
king
there.
had changed.
His power was still
Not
there.
because he was weak.
His experience
His
was
muscles
still
were still
there.
there.
But
His power
something
was still
essential
there.
had been taken
His
from him.
experience was still
Something
there.
that couldn't
But
be
something
rebuilt
essential
just
had been
by
taken
letting
from him.
wounds heal.
Something
The pride's response was immediate. The younger lions stopped respecting him. They began challenging him for food at kills. The older females started moving their cubs away from him at night, as if his presence was becoming dangerous instead of protective. Within days, the dynamic of the entire pride had shifted. Rampage was still the largest male. He was still technically the dominant lion. But dominance without respect is just a body taking up space. And the pride had stopped respecting him. By the 4th week, the situation had become desperate. The 5 males were now entering Rampage's territory regularly. They weren't hiding anymore. They were walking through the bush in the middle of the day, roaring, scent marking, announcing themselves like they already owned the place. And Rampage couldn't stop them. Not because he wasn't strong enough, but because his own pride was no longer supporting him. When the 5 males challenged a territorial boundary, the younger males should have come to their king's side. Instead, they watched from a distance. When the invaders got close to the females, the pride's response should have been to band together under Rampage's leadership. Instead, they dispersed on their own, trying to protect themselves without waiting for their king. The horror of what was happening was that it was all happening in silence. There were no dramatic battles. There were no final stands. There was just the slow dissolution of a kingdom, piece by piece, day by day, as every member of the pride silently accepted that the king was finished. And the worst part, the part that made this story almost unbearable to watch, was that Rampage understood exactly what was happening. He could see it in the eyes of his own offspring. He could hear it in the way the pride organized itself in his absence. He could feel it every time he tried to roar and his voice came out wrong. 3 days after the 5th week, the 5 males entered Rampage's territory one final time. This time they walked directly toward the pride. They were no longer asking for permission. They were no longer challenging from the borders. They were coming to claim what they believed was already theirs. Rampage moved to meet them. Moving as fast as his injuries would allow, the pride watched from a distance. The younger males did not move to his side. The females did not gather around him. They just watched and waited and prepared themselves for a new king. The second fight was different from the first. In the first fight, Rampage had been at his full strength. He had fought with power and speed and the confidence of an animal that had never experienced serious defeat. This fight was different. This fight was a wounded king trying to prove something to animals that had already stopped believing. The 5 males barely let the fight last a minute before Rampage understood that he couldn't win. His left eye was still functionally blind. His shoulder still wouldn't rotate the full distance. His damaged voice meant he couldn't even roar to intimidate them. When the scarred male drove at him again, this time for his remaining good eye, Rampage didn't fight back. He turned and walked away from the fight while it was still happening. He walked toward the river. He walked alone. And the roars of the 5 males as they claimed his territory echoed behind him like the sound of a funeral. Within hours, the pride had accepted the new males. The females who had been hiding their affection suddenly made themselves available for mating. The cubs that had been keeping distance suddenly played around the 5 invaders like they had always been part of the family. The territory had new owners, and Rampage had become a ghost haunting the edges of his own former kingdom. The Kalahari is a place where weakened animals don't survive long. It's not just about other predators, though there are plenty of those. It's about everything. The heat doesn't care if you're injured. The lack of water doesn't make exceptions for wounded kings. The hunger that follows failed hunts doesn't spare animals that used to be dominant. Rampage learned this truth over the next 3 months. Every day was a lesson in what it meant to be invisible. He had gone from being the most recognizable lion in the entire reserve to being an animal that other lions actively avoided. When he approached a kill made made by hyenas, the hyenas themselves would chase him away, not because they were stronger, but because they could sense the weakness in him. They could smell the damaged confidence. Animals understand things about each other that humans rarely notice. They understand the difference between an animal that's temporarily hurt and an animal that's broken. Rampage had become the second type. Hunting became almost impossible. His left eye meant he had no depth perception on that side. When he tried to stalk prey, the impalas would scatter before he got close enough to charge. The zebras would see his approach and run toward the herd instead of away from it. He was losing weight. His ribs started showing beneath his skin. The thick mane that had once been his signature feature began falling out in patches. By the 8th week alone, he looked like a completely different animal. He looked like he was dying. And maybe he was. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected, because something happened during those months of solitude and pain and hunger that changed Rampage from a broken king into something far more dangerous than he had ever been when he was powerful. He started watching every night when the 5 new males would roar and patrol and announce their dominance. Rampage would watch from the shadows. He would observe exactly where they went. He would note which male hunted which territory. He would track which female they were mating with, when they rested, how long they stayed in any given area. He was doing what he should have done during the attack itself. He was paying attention. He was learning their patterns. He was studying them the way a hunter studies prey. The 5 males had taken his territory, but they didn't understand it the way Rampage did. They didn't know where the waterholes were that still had water during the driest parts of the year. They didn't know which paths the buffalo herds used during their seasonal migrations. They didn't know about the rocky outcrops where a lone male could defend against multiple attackers. They had strength in numbers, but they didn't have the knowledge that comes from 7 years of living in every corner of this land. Rampage was learning something else too, something that came from the loneliness and pain. He was learning that the strongest animal doesn't always win. He was learning that the animal with the most patience sometimes does. He was learning that sometimes the best hunters are the ones that nobody sees coming. By the 3rd month, something strange started happening. The pride that had abandoned him so completely, the females that had started mating with the new males so quickly, they were starting to have problems with their new king. The 5 males were more aggressive than Rampage had ever been. They were more violent. They were killing cubs that weren't theirs, not just the ones born while they were establishing dominance, but cubs that were born after they took over, just because the males weren't sired by them. They were fighting constantly among themselves over mating rights and territory boundaries. The pride was becoming unstable. One of the 5 males, a darker one named Black Scar, was starting to show signs of infection in his back leg. He had been limping more and more severely over the past few weeks. Rampage noticed this from his hiding place in the rocks. He noticed everything. The way the male was separating from the group more and more. The way he was hunting alone instead of with the coalition. The way the infection in his leg was getting worse, not better. That's when Rampage made a decision that would have been impossible for the king he used to be. He decided to follow Black Scar, not to fight him, not immediately, but to understand him, to observe him, to wait for the exact moment when the male would be most vulnerable, to study the way a hunter studies his prey. For 2 weeks, Rampage tracked Black Scar's movements. He watched the male hunt unsuccessfully 3 times. He watched him struggling through the water at the river crossing, his infected leg barely able to support his weight. He watched him separating further and further from the other 4 males, until eventually the coalition was functioning as 4, not 5. And Rampage understood. The infection was doing the work that Rampage couldn't do through fighting. One morning, Black Scar went to the small waterhole near the eastern edge of the territory. It was a place where animals had to come if they wanted to drink, because it was the only water for kilometers in any direction. Rampage had been waiting near that waterhole since before dawn. He was hidden in the shadows of the rocks, barely visible, barely breathing. He had learned to move like a ghost. He had learned to wait with a patience that only comes from being broken and having nothing else to do but think. When Black Scar limped down to the water, he was alone. The infection had finally gotten bad enough that the male could barely walk. His back leg was swollen to almost twice its normal size. He was desperate for water, desperate for relief, desperate for anything that would help him feel less like he was dying. He didn't see Rampage in the rocks, didn't smell him until it was too late, didn't have time to run. The attack was fast and brutal, but it wasn't like the attacks Rampage used to make when he was the undisputed king. Those attacks were about dominance. This attack was about survival.
This attack was about
It was about proving that even a broken animal could still hunt, could still fight, could still kill. It took Rampage almost 4 minutes to finish Black Scar, and when it was done, the damaged king dragged the body into the rocks and fed for the first time in weeks. The roar that came out of Rampage's throat that evening was different from anything anyone had ever heard. It wasn't the full-bodied, ground-shaking roar of his powerful years, but it wasn't the broken, desperate sound of his wounded months either. It was something in between. It was a roar that said, "I'm still here, I'm still alive, and I'm still dangerous." The 4 remaining males heard that roar from kilometers away, and something in the sound made them understand that they had a problem. They found the body of Black Scar the next morning. They found the signs of the fight. They found the evidence that Rampage had killed one of them. And for the first time since they had taken the territory, they were afraid. Not because Rampage was the strongest anymore, but because he was something worse. He was an animal with nothing left to lose. He was an animal that had already accepted his own death and had decided to make that death cost something. He was an animal that hunted like a predator, not like a king. The 4 remaining males tried to find him. They searched the territory with growing desperation. They roared challenges that went unanswered. They moved through the bush looking for a male that had become invisible. Rampage was no longer interested in territorial displays. He wasn't interested in roaring to announce his presence. He was interested in one thing only, killing the males that had broken him. And he was willing to wait as long as it took. 3 days after Black Scar's death, one of the other males, a younger one called Redmane, went hunting alone. That was his mistake. Rampage had been watching his patterns for months. He knew that Redmane preferred to hunt in the northern sector, away from the others. He knew that the male followed the same basic path every time. He knew where the ambush points were, where the attack would have the best chance of success, where the prey animal would have the least room to escape or call for help. Redmane never saw Rampage coming. The attack came from behind, from the rocks above the hunting trail. Rampage fell on him with a weight that had been waiting for months to explode. The younger male tried to fight back, tried to roar, tried to call for his brothers, but Rampage was quicker. Despite his injuries, he was meaner, he was hungrier, and most importantly, he didn't hesitate. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. When the other 3 males heard Redmane's dying roar, they understood something that made them gather together immediately. They started moving as a unit again. They stopped spreading out. They stopped hunting alone. They were starting to realize what was happening. They were being hunted, and the hunter was the animal they had wounded and broken and left for dead. The animal they thought they had defeated so completely that he would just fade away into the bush and disappear. But Rampage had no intention of disappearing. Over the next 6 weeks, Rampage killed 2 more of the 4 remaining males, not through dramatic battles fought in the open where the other 2 could come help, but through patient hunting, through understanding the territory better than any of them ever could, through waiting in shadows and striking from darkness and disappearing before they could even understand what was happening. He had become something that the reserve had never seen before. He had become a ghost that other lions feared. The pride noticed the change immediately. The females started moving back toward the edges of the territory where Rampage had been hiding. The cubs started playing in areas he frequented. The younger males started showing the kind of deference that comes from fear, not respect. But fear was enough. It was better than the active disrespect they had shown when he was wounded and powerless. Because power, the real power, is when animals avoid you because they're afraid. Not because they think you're strong, but because they think you might kill them. By the end of the 3rd month of Rampage's hunt, only one of the 5 original invaders remained. His name was Stoneface, and he was the scarred male who had led the original attack. The one who had been missing part of his ear before any of this started. The one who had coordinated the assault that broke Rampage's body and voice. The one who had most directly contributed to the king's fall from power. Stoneface had figured out what was happening. He had watched the other 4 males die or disappear. He understood that he was next. But instead of running, instead of trying to escape the territory, he did something that nobody expected. He started roaring. Not challenges, not territorial announcements, just roars, deep, repeated, constant roars that echoed across the entire reserve every single night. He was calling for help. He was sending a signal that said, "I'm in danger. I need backup. Is anyone out there who wants to challenge this land and take it from the remaining male? The roars were desperate and obvious, but they were also smart. Stoneface was betting that there were nomadic males out there somewhere who would see an opportunity, a territory that was weakening, a coalition that was falling apart, a chance to take something for themselves. And he was right. Within 2 weeks, 2 nomadic males answered those roars. They came from the northern reaches of the reserve, hungry and desperate like all nomadic males are. They saw the roars as an invitation, an opportunity. They came to the territory ready to fight for it, thinking that the roars were coming from a male who wanted to recruit allies, not a male who was trying to escape death. When they arrived and discovered that Stoneface was trying to use them as protection against Rampage, they didn't care. They just saw what they had always wanted, a territory that they could fight for. They moved in immediately, challenging the remaining males, trying to claim the land through force. And in the chaos that followed, in the middle of all that confusion and violence and territory-changing hands, Rampage made his final move. He came out of the shadows like a ghost made flesh. He moved through the darkness with a precision and a silence that would have been impossible for the old king, the arrogant king, the king who thought roaring was the same as strength. This new Rampage didn't roar. He didn't announce himself. He moved through the bush like a hunting predator, and he came for Stoneface with a focus that had been building for 3 months. The fight between Rampage and Stoneface was different from all the others. This wasn't a young male versus a broken king. This wasn't a coalition against an individual. This was predator versus predator. This was a hunter versus a hunter. And this was the moment when every animal in the reserve would understand what had really happened during those 3 months of silence. The night Stoneface died was different from every other night in the reserve. The sky had no moon. The wind was moving in patterns that made it impossible for animals to trust their sense of smell. It was the kind of night where a predator could move unseen and unheard. And that's exactly what Rampage understood when he emerged from the rocks near the waterhole where Stoneface was waiting. The scarred male heard him at the last second. That's all the warning he got. 1 second of awareness before Rampage was already on him, already driving him backward into the dirt with a force that seemed impossible from an animal that had been starving for months. But Rampage hadn't been starving in his mind. He had been feeding on something far more powerful than meat. He had been feeding on purpose, on understanding, on the knowledge that this moment was coming, and that he would be ready. Stoneface tried to fight back the way the original 4 had fought back all those weeks ago. He tried to call for his allies, the 2 nomadic males who were supposed to be helping him hold the territory. But those males were fighting each other on the opposite side of the Pride's range. They didn't hear his roar. They didn't come to help. Stoneface was alone, the way Rampage had been alone, and alone against a hunter like Rampage. Alone meant death. The fight lasted almost 3 minutes. It was brutal and silent, and exactly as clinical as everything Rampage had become during his months of exile. He didn't waste energy on dramatic movements. He didn't roar or posture or try to intimidate. He just methodically broke Stoneface down, targeting the weak points he had learned through months of observation. The scarred male's right front leg had never been as strong as his left. The scar tissue on his face meant his bite was slightly misaligned. These tiny weaknesses were things that Rampage had documented in his mind during all those weeks of watching. Now he exploited every single one of them. When Stoneface was finally still in the dirt, Rampage didn't feed immediately like he had with the others. He sat down next to the body of the male that had broken him, and he did something that no one had seen him do since the attack 3 months ago. He roared, not the broken sound he had produced in those first desperate weeks, not the silent hunting calls he had learned to use, but a real roar, a roar that carried the pain and the hunger and the rage of everything he had endured, a roar that echoed across the entire reserve and made every animal that heard it understand that something fundamental had changed. The 2 nomadic males heard that roar. They stopped fighting each other immediately. They looked at each other with an understanding that passed between them without words. This territory wasn't worth it. Whatever they had been fighting for, whatever dreams they had of claiming this land, they were nothing compared to the thing that was roaring in the darkness. One of them started backing away, the other followed. Within minutes, both nomadic males were running toward the borders of the territory, moving as fast as their legs could carry them. They didn't stop running until they were kilometers away. The pride heard that roar too. The females who had abandoned Rampage, the cubs he had fathered, the younger males who had stopped supporting him. They all heard the sound, and they all understood what it meant. The territory had a king again. Not the old king, not the animal they had known before, but a king nonetheless. And this king was different. This king had learned things that the old king never knew. This king was dangerous in ways that power alone could never make an animal dangerous. By dawn, the news had spread through the entire reserve. Rangers who monitored the lions found Stoneface's body near the waterhole. They documented the scene, they examined the wounds, and they understood immediately what had happened. The broken king hadn't just survived his exile, he had evolved. He had transformed from a dominant animal into something that looked more like a hunter than a lion. The way he moved, the way he killed, the way he had systematically eliminated each of the 5 males that had broken him, it all pointed to a level of intelligence and patience that most animals never developed. Within the first week after Stoneface's death, the pride began restructuring itself. The females that had been mating with the invaders stopped. The cubs that had been born during those months suddenly had a new protector. The younger males who had learned to disrespect Rampage when he was broken now learned a different lesson. They learned that disrespect could be fatal. They learned that this king was not an animal to take for granted. They learned that power could return in forms they didn't expect. Rampage didn't immediately return to his old patterns. He didn't spend hours roaring territorial challenges. He didn't spend his days walking the boundaries with his head held high. Instead, he moved through the territory with a purpose that was different from anything anyone had seen from him before. He was still hunting, still learning, still understanding the land in ways that most animals never could. The damage to his eye was permanent. He would never see perfectly again, but he had learned to compensate. He had learned to move in ways that worked around his limitations instead of being defeated by them. The pride began to thrive again. The females that had been waiting for a strong protector found one. But it wasn't the same kind of strength they had known before. Rampage didn't brute force his way through problems anymore. When young nomadic males tried to infiltrate his territory, he didn't immediately charge them. Instead, he studied them. He learned their patterns. He identified their weaknesses, and then he eliminated them with a precision that made every other animal understand that this wasn't just a strong male. This was an intelligent hunter. The cubs born after Rampage's return grew up watching something different than cubs usually see. They grew up watching their father move through the bush with a patience and a calculation that was more predator than king. They learned from him not just through genetics, but through observation. The young males learned how to hunt more efficiently. The young females learned how to evaluate threats and respond to them without panic. Everything about the pride changed because everything about their king had changed. Ragnars began noting something strange in their records. Rampage was living longer than most male lions. He should have died during those 3 months when he was alone and starving. By all logic, he should have been dead, but instead he was thriving, not in the way he had thrived before, but in a different way. The weight came back to his body, but it was different weight. It was leaner. It was meaner. It was the weight of an animal that had learned how to survive on less because it had learned how to hunt more efficiently. By the end of the year, something remarkable had happened. Rampage's territory had expanded. The areas that had been controlled by the 5 invaders were now controlled by him, but not through the kind of aggressive territorial expansion the old Rampage would have used. Instead, he had simply outlasted every challenge. Every male that tried to take his territory found that this wasn't an animal they could fight. Every coalition that tried to establish themselves in his borders found that they were being hunted by something far more dangerous than a simple dominant male. The silence that had terrified the pride in those first weeks after the attack had transformed into something else. It had become the silence of a predator, the silence of an animal that doesn't need to announce its presence because its presence is already understood, the silence of a hunter that moves through the bush knowing exactly what it's doing and exactly what it's hunting. And the most remarkable thing was that the pride understood this change completely. They had abandoned him when he was broken. They had rejected him when his voice became damaged. But now, watching him move through the territory with that eerie silence and that calculated precision, they began to understand something important. Power isn't just about being the strongest. Power is about being the most dangerous. And Rampage had become the most dangerous animal in the entire reserve. The males that had broken him were all dead now. One killed by infection and Rampage's patience. 3 killed through calculated hunts that showed more intelligence than strength. 1 killed in direct combat when his pride and the reserve itself had finally understood what he had become. And through it all, through every moment of that transformation, Rampage had learned the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes being broken is the only way to become whole. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to understand what truly matters. Sometimes the strongest thing an animal can do is survive when everyone has already counted it dead. 5 years passed after Rampage reclaimed his territory. 5 years of a reign that looked nothing like the reign that came before. The old Rampage had been a king. The new Rampage was something different. He was a legend. Animals spoke about him in ways they didn't speak about other lions. The roars that carried across the reserve at night were roars that made every animal listen carefully, because those roars didn't carry threats the way normal territorial roars did. They carried something darker. They carried the weight of an animal that had already proven it could kill anything that challenged it. Rangers who tracked him documented changes that shouldn't have been possible. His eye, damaged permanently in the attack, had never healed properly. The socket was scarred. The lid hung lower than it should. He could see maybe 70% out of that eye on a good day, but his hunting success rate had actually increased, not decreased like it should have. He was taking down prey more efficiently than he had when he was at his absolute peak of physical power. Scientists who studied him began to understand what had happened during those 3 months of isolation and hunting. He hadn't just learned to survive with his limitations. He had learned to hunt better because of them. The pride reflected his transformation. The young males that grew up under his leadership were different from young males in other prides. They didn't learn dominance first and intelligence second. They learned to think before they acted. They learned to observe before they attacked. They learned that patience was more valuable than aggression. Some of them even survived to adulthood, which was remarkable because most young males either died or were driven out by their father before they reached full size. But Rampage didn't drive them out aggressively. Instead, he allowed them to stay long enough to learn everything they needed to survive. Then he would encourage them to leave, to find their own territory, to build their own lives somewhere else in the reserve. The females had learned something different. They had learned that a strong king wasn't necessarily a good king, but a dangerous king was something else entirely. Rampage mated with them, but he didn't control them the way he had before. He understood something that most dominant males never figured out. The females who chose to stay because they wanted to stay were worth infinitely more than females that stayed because they had no choice. So he gave them choices. He allowed them to hunt in ways they preferred. He didn't interrupt their nursing of cubs unless absolutely necessary. He moved through the territory in ways that respected their space. This new approach should have made him weaker. In theory, any animal expert would have predicted that a male who didn't control his females absolutely would lose them to other males. But the opposite happened. The females stayed with him by choice. They defended him. They helped him defend the territory. When young nomadic males tried to establish themselves in Rampage's land, the females would actively fight against them, not because they were forced to, but because they understood what they had in Rampage. They had a male that was intelligent enough to keep them safe. A male that was strong enough to defeat any challenger, a male that was brutal enough to eliminate threats before they could become real problems. The territory itself seemed to flourish under his protection. The prey populations remained stable because Rampage hunted efficiently, only taking what he needed. The water holes remained safe because he controlled them strictly. Other predators like leopards and hyenas learned quickly that this territory had a lion that was far more dangerous than most lions. They learned to hunt elsewhere. They learned to avoid confrontation with an animal that didn't just defend his territory defensively. He actively hunted any predator that represented a threat to his pride or his land. But nothing lasts forever in the African bush. By the 5th year, something began changing in Rampage's body. The years of constant hunting and constant vigilance were beginning to take their toll. The scar tissue that had formed after the attack was starting to cause him pain. The weight that had returned after the exile was beginning to feel heavy in ways it hadn't before. The muscles that had carried him through 5 years of rain were starting to show their age. One morning, during what should have been a routine patrol, Rampage collapsed. His back legs simply stopped working. Rangers who found him documented the event carefully. The male was conscious. His eyes were alert. His mind was still sharp. But his body had finally reached a limit that it couldn't push past anymore. The damage from the original attack, combined with 5 years of constant hunting and constant stress, had finally broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed. The pride understood what was happening immediately. They gathered around him but kept their distance. Animals understand death in ways that humans sometimes miss. They understand when an animal is beginning its final transition. Some of the younger females brought him water from the nearby stream, carrying it in their mouths and letting it drip near him. The cubs that had been born under his protection came and rested nearby, as if bearing witness to the end of an era. Rampage lasted 3 more days. On the fourth day, he tried to stand one final time. His front legs were strong enough. His determination was strong enough. But his back legs would no longer obey. He managed to rise to his front, his head held high, his damaged eyes still watching the territory that had been his. And then, slowly, he lowered himself back down into the dust. The roar that came from his throat that evening wasn't the roar of dominance. It wasn't a territorial call or a challenge to enemies. It was something simpler. It was the roar of an animal that had lived fully, had fought completely, had transformed from a broken king into something that transcended kingship entirely. It was the roar of an animal saying goodbye. By the next morning, Rampage was gone. His body was found by rangers near the river, the place where he had first begun his recovery all those years ago. The scar tissue from the attack was still visible on his shoulder. The damage to his eye was still evident, but the body itself had become part of the landscape. The territory continued without him, the way all territories continue when a king falls. But something remarkable happened in the weeks after his death. The pride didn't fracture, the territory didn't collapse. Instead, they continued forward, carrying with them the lessons that Rampage had taught through his transformation. The young males he had trained moved to new territories and established themselves with an intelligence that surprised other prides. The females that had learned to work alongside him created a structure that was more stable than many prides that had dominant males. Rangers who tracked the reserve in the years after Rampage's death documented something that had never been fully documented before. A lion's legacy doesn't end when the lion dies. It continues in the animals he taught. It continues in the territory he shaped. It continues in the way other animals approach dominance and survival. Rampage had been broken by the attack, but in being broken, he had learned something that the powerful never learn. He had learned that survival isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the smartest. It's about understanding your enemies before they understand you. It's about using intelligence as a weapon when strength fails. The 5 males who had attacked him were all dead now. Their names were forgotten. Their territory was claimed by others. But Rampage's name remained. In the roars of lions that carried his genes, in the hunting patterns of prides that had learned from watching him, in the memory of rangers who had witnessed his transformation from broken king to something far greater than kingship itself, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moved through the reserve in certain ways, animals would still hear the echo of his roar, not the roar of dominance, but the roar of an animal that had learned the most important lesson the African bush could teach. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is survive. Sometimes the most terrifying thing you can become is an animal that has already accepted its own death and decided to make that death mean something. This is the story of Rampage. The lion who lost his strength but found something far more valuable. The king who was broken and became unbreakable. The animal whose silence terrified the entire reserve because they understood what that silence meant. It meant an animal was hunting. It meant intelligence was at work. It meant that in the African bush, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the loudest roar. It's the roar that never comes. It's the presence felt in the darkness. It's the predator that moves like a ghost and strikes like lightning. Rampage taught the reserve something new. He taught them that power has many faces, and sometimes the most powerful animal isn't the one roaring the loudest. It's the one that understands exactly when to stay silent.